Hello everyone, my name is Shubham Chaudhary and today we will be learning about the mental petrology and some interesting facts related to the mental petrology along with some recent developments. Nowadays there is a proportionate increment in the questions which are asked in your competitive exams related to recently discovered some of the theories, and by saying that we don't mean that we have to go and read all the research papers published every single day, but yet there are few topics which you have to be aware of and which we will be learning in this lecture. So let's get started firstly with the Earth's mantle. As you all know that Earth's mantle is chiefly composed of the peridotitic rock, or we can say chiefly your Earth is peridotite in composition or peridotitic in composition, and to study the mantle is altogether an interesting fact because it encompasses around 84% of all of the Earth's volume and around 60% of its mass. So in order to understand the Earth's geodynamic behavior, for example, all your plate tectonic theories and all the recently discovered facts related to the seismic activity, it's very vital to study the petrological composition of the mantle along with their rheological and all that properties. So firstly we will go with the classification and the general information which is there in your static subject. So as we already told that 84% of whole of the Earth's mass is composed only by mantle, which makes it interesting to study, because dealing with the mantle in details you will be having an idea of Earth's internal structures and dynamics, studying the vast, or we would say the majority, the major component of all three layers, including crust, mantle and core. So 67% of the Earth's mass is composed only by the mantle, we already discussed. Now moving on to the composition or the classification of ultramafic rocks. So prior to that, it is to be noted that all your movement or convection in the mantle, they precisely control Earth's volcanic behavior, Earth's volcanic processes, and in turn they also control the seismic activity occurring within the Earth's surface. So it is very essential firstly to know about the composition of the Earth's mantle's rock, and as we said that Earth's mantle is chiefly composed of peridotites, which are ultramafic rocks. If we talk about the broader term which we use to classify the rocks, so you must be very familiar with all type of rocks, whether felsic, intermediate, mafic or ultramafic. We will be talking about only the ultramafic rocks which are there in the mantle. This is a triangular diagram which shows that and at what basis we classify ultramafic rocks, whether they are to be said peridotite or they are to be said pyroxenites. So I have received a number of questions of students related to the classification only. There is a vast confusion which should not be there. It's very simple. Any rock to be called as peridotite, you just need to have at least 40% of olivine. So in this triangular diagram we will be dealing with all this stuff in detail. Here we have taken at this point it is olivine. Here we have taken the orthopyroxene and this is the clinopyroxene. So in this triangular diagram, if you start moving if you start moving from olivine to orthopyroxene, your olivine content will be decreasing as per the lever rule you must have already studied in your subject. So as you go down, your olivine content will decrease and you'll be entering in the orthopyroxene rich component of rocks which are which is very essential to call them the pyroxenites. So firstly, let's talk about when do we call them peridotites and when do we call them the pyroxenites. So as I said, let's draw a line here in this triangular diagram. So any rock which is composed of at least 40% of olivine. When I say at least, it can be more than 40%, but at least it has to be containing 40% of olivine. It will be called as the peridotite. There are certain other classifications of the peridotites based on their mineralogical composition, but let's broadly firstly classify these ultramafic rocks into peridotite and pyroxenite. So until your olivine component is at least 40%, you will be calling that rock peridotite, whether it's 90%, 80, 70, 60, at least up to the 40% of the olivine content, you will be calling that ultramafic rock as peridotite. And when your olivine content starts to decrease below 40, and it will be automatically enriching in clinopyroxene, whether orthopyroxene or clinopyroxene. So you will be entering in the pyroxenite zone. That means your rock is now chiefly composed of the pyroxenes, whether orthopyroxene or clinopyroxene, in order to be called as the pyroxenites. So let's firstly just talk about the peridotites here. In this portion you will be noticing that when your olivine percent is at least 90% or more than that, you will be calling that rock dunite. The most primitive ultramafic rocks in peridotite section, which is at least 90% composes of, it is composed 90% of olivine, and we call it dunite. Essentially it has to be having 90% of olivine content. It may be more than that also. Now as you go down on this line, and your olivine content will automatically be decreasing, whether you will go this way or this way. So moving from olivine to orthopyroxene down this line, as your olivine will be decreasing below 90% and the orthopyroxene content will be increasing, your rock would be called as Herzbergite, which is composed of olivine in a decent amount, say above 40 and below 90, and your orthopyroxene, which is OPX, which will be in the proportionate amount to be equated at as 100%. So when your olivine will be decreasing along the orthopyroxene line and your olivine will at least be more than 40%, your rock will be called as Herzbergite. And in the same way, where we go from olivine to clinopyroxene line, in the portion where still your olivine is 40% and your olivine starts to decrease and your clinopyroxene content will be increasing in the mineralogical composition of ultramafic rock, that rock would be called as weyerlite. So in weyerlite you will have more than 40% olivine. That's the essential condition for the rocks, ultramafic rocks, to be called as peridotites, and you will be having clinopyroxene in a decent amount. So on what basis we will differentiate between Herzbergite and weyerlite, that is also very essential to note here. Let's draw a line this way in this diagram. So, and we already said that we are just talking about this portion, so just forget about the lower one for a moment. So more than 40% is olivine, that's why we are calling them peridotites. So if we draw a line like this, that means this part is divided into two portions. So here we have OPX and here we have the CPX. So as your OPX will be decreasing and your composition will start to shift towards the clinopyroxene, your rock will be changed from Herzbergite to Lherzolite to Wehrlite. So you will see, as your olivine is always at least 40 or more than that 40%, but as the CPX component will be increasing in the petrological or mineralogical composition, and your OPX will be decreasing, and you will be going from this way. So your composition will be called, your petrological classification will be changing from Herzbergite to Lherzolite and ultimately to the Wehrlite, which is believed chiefly composed of clinopyroxene other than the olivine content. Now this is all about the peridotite component. Let's again draw a line here. Now we'll be talking about the olivine below 40% zone. That means we'll be talking about the figure below this line, this red line. Now all of the ultramafic rocks falling in this section will be called as pyroxenites, because these are chiefly and essentially composed of the pyroxene content. And based on that, we have given them name orthopyroxenite or clinopyroxenite according to the content of OPX or CPX in those rocks. The one which will be having at least around 80 to 90% pyroxene and almost equal amount of say OPX and CPX, and will be lying in this area, will be called as websterite typically. But in this portion, all the points falling will be called as the websterite, where you will have almost equal component of OPX and CPX subsequently. And as you will go upside, that means you are moving towards the olivine, so your websterite will be called as the olivine websterite. So to summarize this diagram, chiefly ultramafic rocks according to this diagram are called either the peridotites or pyroxenites, based upon the mineralogical composition of olivine or pyroxene. And when we talk about pyroxenes, we again talk about the orthopyroxenes and clinopyroxenes. So a rock, an ultramafic rock, to be essentially called as peridotite, it needs to have at least 40% or more than that olivine content. If your olivine content will be decreasing below 40, you will be shifting to the pyroxenite zone. So there must not be any confusion now. When do we call them the peridotites, and when they are to be called as, these ultramafic rocks to be called as pyroxenites. So the broader composition or the broader division is that the olivine component, it has to be at least 40 or more than 40 and ultramafic rocks to be called as peridotites. And when your olivine content will be decreasing, and the clinopyroxene or orthopyroxene, in general way the pyroxene will be increasing, you will be calling them the pyroxenites. Now moving next, let's talk about the melting of mantle rocks and formation of magma in the mantle. We all know that peridotite, when it melts, it gives rise to the basaltic magma, and your crust and mantle both are in solid form. Then there is a question which arises, that where does this magma come from which feeds the volcanoes? If your crust is also in solid state, your mantle is also in solid state, then there has to be a mechanism of melting of these rocks which can produce the basaltic magma through the melting of peridotites. So when we talk about the melting of mantle or mantle rocks, which are chiefly peridotite, it is about the top 200 kilometer portion which helps to generate the melt, or which actually melts to produce the basaltic magmatism. So you all know that up to the 100 kilometers, the portion of the mantle is called as the lithosphere, which contains upper part, in the upper portion the crust as well, and up to 100 to 200 the layer is called the asthenosphere. So this from crust to asthenosphere portion, which is around 200 kilometer, is only the portion which is responsible for generating the magmatism or melts in the mantle. So there is a distance going down in the mantle, and pressure and temperature curve, as you can see, this green curve is showing the mantle geotherm. That means which shows us the temperature of the mantle rocks at different depths, and we can have an idea that how does the mantle geotherm behave, or how does the temperature increases as we go deep down in the mantle. Corresponding to your depth scale, there is a pressure scale here where we have shown the pressure in gigapascal, which is 10 to the power 9 Pascal. So there is a conversion from pressure to depth. If you want to convert, the 1 GPa constitutes around 33 kilometers. So if we are talking about the 4 GPa, you can automatically calculate that at what depth the 4 GPa pressure can be expected. As I shown that 1 GPa is around 33 kilometers. So you can have an idea that 4 GPa will be shown at around 132 kilometers. So this is a depth pressure to depth conversion. So let's talk about the mantle geotherm curve here. From top to the 100 kilometer or the lithospheric depth, as you can see, this is your crust and this is your lithosphere and this is the asthenosphere. So we are showing the whole of this diagram up to 200 kilometers, which I earlier told that the portion of the mantle which helps to generate the magmatism through the melting of peridotites is only the top 200 kilometers portion. And if you talk about the state of the rocks in the crust or lithosphere, so these rocks are cooler and stronger compared to the mantle rocks, which are hotter and weaker. So mantle rocks in specifically in asthenosphere, they are the one who can which can convect and which are in the flowable state. So let's come back to the geothermal curve, mantle geotherm. You will notice that the slope from say at surface to the lithospheric depths at around 100 kilometer, the slope from horizontal is quite steep, or we would say that it is around 45 degrees, which shows that the temperature in the top 100 kilometer portion varies at a significant amount or increases at a significant amount, which is around 15 degrees Celsius per kilometers. So if we talk about in this portion, if you will go from there to there all the way down in the mantle, you will experience the 15 degrees Celsius per kilometer increment in the temperature. And that's why we call it the conductive curve in this top 100 kilometer portion, because up to the 100 kilometer and up to the lithospheric mantle, these rocks help to lose the heat from mantle in the form of conduction. Since this layer is cooler and stronger, so it can only lose the heat from the mantle in the form of conduction. So that's why we are calling this curve as conductive curve in this portion, while the curve which becomes more steeper in this portion from 100 to 200 in the asthenospheric mantle is called as the adiabatic curve, where you will see the temperature increment is very slight. It is around 0.5 degrees per kilometer. So why we are calling this curve, the mantle geotherm from 100 to 200 in asthenosphere, as adiabatic curve? It is slightly different from the typical definition of the adiabatic processes. So when it comes to our mind, the adiabatic process, according to the thermodynamics, adiabatic is a process where the system is completely isolated from the surroundings, so that it cannot exchange the heat or matter with the surroundings. But in this case, we call this curve adiabatic because along this curve the temperature changes very slightly, where the pressure is changed very at a considerable rate. So that's why we are calling it the adiabatic curve. So all of this explanation we are drawing here to tell you about the melting behavior of the mantle. So if I draw a curve here like this, it is a basic phenomena of a substance that if you want to melt the substance, you need to have a certain temperature so that it can get to a molten state, and which temperature is called the solidus temperature. So any rock to be in the molten state, it has to be experienced the higher temperature than its solidus line, so that we can say that this beyond this temperature, this material will be in the molten state. For example, the peridotites, I am drawing a line here. Let's assume it is the solidus line of your peridotites. That means above this line, the temperature more than around 1200 degrees C, this peridotites will be in the molten state, since the temperature is higher than the solidus, and below this temperature these rocks will be in the solid state. So that's why we call it the solidus temperature curve. So to melt the metal in as you must have noticed that in normal condition your mental geotherm is not crossing your solidus temperature curve of the mental peridotite. So at normal conditions mental rocks never melt. You need to have certain mechanisms to make the rocks in a state of molten state. So what are those mechanisms? There are only 3 mechanisms in which you will see that the mental peridotites melt and they give rise to the basaltic magmatism. So we'll be studying about those 3 in the next few slides. So in order to generate the melt from mental peridotites, there are 3 mechanisms which needs to be employed in order to generate the basaltic magma from the mental peridotites. So the first mechanism is the intraplate mental plume setting. As you all know, the mental plume is an abnormally hot upwelling of the mental rocks, which when they interact with the lithospheric mantle, they raise the temperature of the lithospheric base at around 100 kilometers, and subsequently this solid so when they raise the temperature of lithospheric base at around 100 kilometers, subsequently your mental geotherm curve is moved upward to the higher temperatures, and the temperature is raised so that the yellow solidus curve of your peridotites is crossed, and in this portion you see that your mental peridotites starts to melt. What actually happens is that usually in usual conditions your mental rocks will never melt. So you need to have certain mechanisms or conditions in order to generate the melt from your mental rocks. So as you saw in the previous slide that in normal conditions your solidus is never crossed by the mental geotherm, so mental rocks never melt. But when it comes to the mental plumes, when the mental plume rises through the asthenosphere and they interact with the base of lithosphere, what happens is that they raise the temperature of the surroundings, and so this mental geotherm is also raised in terms of the temperature, and it crosses this yellow curve of solidus of the mental peridotites, and after its crossing, this is the portion which starts to melt and which starts to generate the melt from the mental rocks, which is the basaltic magma. As we also studied in the previous slide that to melt any substance you need to raise the temperature above its solidus temperature. So this is the solidus temperature of the mental peridotites, which varies according to the depth. As you will go deeper at high pressures, you need to employ more temperature in order to melt the mental peridotites. So that's why this curve goes like this, because as you are going down, the pressure is increasing, and at higher pressures the mental peridotites melt at comparatively higher temperatures. So when mental plume rises through the asthenosphere and they interact at the base of the lithosphere, they raise the curve mental geotherm beyond the solidus temperature of peridotites, and peridotites start to melt. The next setting is the divergent plate margin. you must have noticed when we saw the normal conditions where the mantle peridotites never melt, since the mantle geotherm is not crossing the solidus line of the peridotite. So you must have noticed that this slope in the conduction portion of this mantle geotherm is a function of the thickness of the lithosphere. The thickest your lithospheric portion will be, the higher will be the slope of your geothermal curve. So in those conditions, for example, the normal conditions, the mantle geotherm curve was like that at around this temperature. But what happened is that when your lithospheric mantle thickness is lowered, for example in the case of divergent plate margin, where your mid-oceanic ridge basaltic magma rises or generates, so there your mantle geotherm curve, due to the low thickness or lesser thickness of lithospheric mantle, your mantle geothermal curve crosses the solidus temperature of the peridotites or mantle peridotites, and the basaltic magmatism starts. By saying that, what do I mean is, let's simplify this. The slope of your conductive portion of mantle geotherm is a function of the thickness of the lithospheric mantle. For example, let's assume a vessel which has a very thick base, and you have some candles over here of different colors. So if you start to heat this vessel, and being the base of the vessel very thick, it will experience the low temperature around this portion, because it will absorb the heat, or it will be working as the insulator of the heat for some time, and it will give time to raise the temperature in this portion. Same goes with the if you reduce the basic width of this vessel, for example, the next one has the smaller base. So if you will heat this with the similar setup, you will experience the same amount of heat as here, and similar will be the here. So that's why we can say that varying the lithospheric mantle thickness, your mantle geotherm will behave differently. For example, for instance, let's assume we reduce our lithospheric mantle in such a way that it comes to the surface. We don't have any lithospheric mantle left, so the mantle potential temperature, this curve will be rising to this temperature for around 1600 degrees C. So if there was no lithospheric mantle to insulate or to provide the buffer or the protection of the temperature, your normal temperature of the surface would have been at around 1600 degrees Celsius. So that's where we have that phenomena, how your lithospheric mantle being very thick prevents the higher temperature of the mantle or the potential temperature of mantle to be rising at the certain level that it can destroy everything being 1600 degrees Celsius at the surface. So when you will lower the thickness of your lithospheric mantle, the mantle geotherm will behave differently, and it will be rising up to this temperature. So as your lithospheric mantle will be thicker, the curve will be like that. So at divergent plate margin, since your lithospheric mantle is very thin, it automatically helps the mantle geotherm to rise up to this level, and it certainly crosses the yellow curve or the solidus temperature of your peridotites. And in this portion here, you will see that your peridotites will start to melt, and they will give rise to the basaltic magmatism. So it is all about the buffer provided by your lithospheric mantle from the higher temperature of mantle or potential temperature of mantle. If your lithosphere will be considerably thick, it will cushion you, or it will be stopping that high temperature to be rising, up to the unbearable conditions. And in the case of the peridotites melting, since the lithospheric mantle is very thin at divergent plate margin, it cannot buffer, or it cannot stop the mantle geotherm to be at the normal level, which we have seen in the first slide, where your normal conditions were there, where the mantle peridotites never melt. For example, this one here, you will see that the lithosphere is this much thicker and your geothermal curve is going like that. So as you will raise this curve to the upper portion, or in a way you will reduce the lithospheric thickness. For example, now your lithosphere is this much thinner and this is your crust, this is your lithosphere. So we have reduced the thickness of the lithosphere. What will happen is that your mantle geotherm curve will go like that. Let me draw it with a different color. So your mantle geotherm will behave like that. This will be your conductive portion, this will be your adiabatic portion. So you are noticing a difference in the mantle geotherm curves. It was there when your lithospheric thickness was considerably at the normal conditions, but when you lowered the thickness of your lithosphere, your green curve or your mantle geotherm shifted to the new one, which is this. And you will notice, as your lithospheric thickness reduced, so did your mantle geotherm increase at the same proportion. So it is the slope of the conduction portion in the mantle geotherm is a function of the lithospheric thickness variation. The thinner will be your lithosphere. For example, let's assume the lithosphere is this much thin. This green is your lithosphere and this is your crust. So in this portion, the mantle geotherm will further increase the temperature and it will go like this. In that case, it will raise the temperature even further. So that's why at the convergent plate margin, due to the lesser thickness of lithosphere, the mantle geotherm is showing the higher temperature, and it automatically crossing the solidus temperature of your peridotites, and your peridotites start to melt and they generate the basaltic magmatism. The third and final mechanism is your convergent plate margin. So melting at this setting is also called as the influx melting, where you need to influx some volatiles in the mantle in order to make the mantle peridotites in the molten, or in order to make them molten. So what happens is that at the convergent plate margin, as your subducting crust goes down in the mantle, it can go up to the lower mantle. So as your subducting crust goes down, the hydrous minerals, due to the breakdown of those minerals, release the water as volatile, and which in turn reduces the solidus temperature of the mantle peridotites. For example, you must be aware of this concept that when you contaminate one substance, for example the X substance is there in your vessel and you need to boil or you need to melt it, and you mix it with the Y substance. So what will Y do is that it will decrease the melting temperature of this X substance. Or in other ways, we can say mixing substance or contaminating a substance with some other substances reduces the melting temperature, or in this case mixing or adding the volatiles to the mantle rocks, which are a result of the breakdown of the subducted hydrous minerals, they lower the solidus temperature of mantle peridotites. As your subducting crust goes down, the breakage of the hydrous minerals take place, and this water expelled from here reacts or mixes with your mantle peridotite here, and it lowers the solidus temperature of the peridotites from there to the this blue curve here. So earlier in the normal conditions, for example, in the previous two mechanism or previous two settings, in the mantle plume settings or your divergent plate settings, the mantle peridotites were showing the solidus curve going like that at around starting from the 1200 and going all the way down to the higher temperatures. But in the case of the convergent plate margin, where the water expelled from the hydrous mineral breakdown is lowering the solidus temperature of your peridotites, the solidus temperature is lowered in fact at a considerable level, that automatically your mantle geotherm, which was there at the normal position, we did not raise the temperature of mantle this time. In the previous cases, your mantle plume raised the temperature of the lithospheric mantle or the base of the lithospheric mantle at around 100 kilometers, and in the divergent plate margin setting, your reduction in the lithospheric thickness attributed to the raising the temperature of your mantle geotherms, because it varied in a different way there. But in this case, the convergent plate margin, we did not do anything special to rise or to raise the temperature of mantle geotherm. Since the water was added to the mantle peridotites through the subduction of a plate and the breakdown of the hydrous minerals, it automatically lowered down the solidus temperature of mantle peridotites in such a way that your mantle geotherm, being at its own place without doing anything, automatically was subjected to cross the solidus temperature of the mantle peridotites, and the same phenomena where your solidus temperature is overcome by the higher temperature curves, your material or your mantle rock will start to melt. All of these crossing of solidus temperatures and starting of the partial melt, we are talking about the partial melting of the mantle peridotites. They will not melt in a snap, like the time your solidus temperature curve will be overcome, or it will be the temperature of the mantle will be gone through beyond that solidus temperature. So it is only a mechanism to start the melting of peridotites. The crossing of the solidus temperature is a starting of melting of the peridotites. They will not be going in a complete molten state. For that you need to further raise the temperature up to the liquidus, so that all of the rock is converted to the liquid. So these were the three mechanisms where your mantle peridotites can melt. First one was the mantle plume settings, where your mantle plume raises the temperature of the mantle, and it subsequently raises the mantle geotherm, and it crosses the solidus temperature of peridotites, and you get the basaltic melt. Second one was the divergent plate margin, where your lithospheric thickness was very low, consequently your mantle geotherm crossed the solidus of the peridotites and you got the basaltic magma. And the third one was where your subducting crust released the water after breakdown of hydrous minerals, and they in turn lowered the solidus temperature of peridotites, and automatically your mantle geotherm crossed it and you got the basaltic magmatism through the partial melting of mantle peridotites. So there are only three mechanisms. Now moving on to the high pressure polymorphs. So as this heading itself suggests, that poly means many and morphs means structures. So those minerals or those substances, we will be talking about the crystals of the mineral only here. So those minerals which are chemically identical but they exist in more than one crystal form or different molecular packings. For example, you must have seen in the case of tridymite and cristobalite, all of those polymorphs of silica or polymorphs of alpha quartz are having the same chemical composition, but due to the crystal system being different, they are called differently. So that's why they are called the polymorphs, which means they have many structures but the chemical composition is the same. So we'll be studying about, apart from those alpha quartz polymorphs, we'll be studying about the high pressure polymorphs of olivine, pyroxene, plagioclase, and so on. So it should be clear that the polymorph is the one which possesses the same chemistry of a crystal but has the different molecular arrangement in the crystal or a different crystal structure. For example, A and B, it also possesses the chemistry, for example, MgNO. This is also MgNO, but the crystal system is different. So we'll calling them the pressure polymorphs. If this difference in the crystal structure or molecular arrangement or molecular packing is because of the high pressure, as you must have noticed that as we go down in the mantle, the pressure is exerted highly. So if your molecular packing change or the rearrangement of the crystal structure is because of the high pressure, so then we will call them those polymorphs as the high pressure polymorphs, since they are polymorphs and they are formed through the high pressure conditions. So as you go deeper in the earth, you will experience or you will see the mineral will be possessing the higher density. Why this happens is because to accommodate certain minerals at high temperature or high pressure, they need to make certain rearrangements in the crystal structures in order to be stable at that particular depth or high pressure or temperature conditions. So the one process or one phenomena or one mechanism that they follow is the making the density high or to pack those crystals very densely, so which helps them to sustain at that high temperature and pressure conditions in the mantle. And you will notice that at upper mantle depths, the minerals possess at upper mantle depths, your mineral or crystal possess oxygen atoms, for example in the silicates, and the silicon and your MgFe cations will be typically having the tetrahedral coordination with the oxygen and the octahedral coordination with the oxygens in usual conditions. I'll be explaining it in details in next slide, with showing you the crystal coordination structure. But here that just it is to be noted that at upper mantle conditions or the comparatively lower pressure conditions in the mantle compared to the lower portion, at upper mantle depths in silicates, your silicon is always tetrahedrally coordinated and your cations, for example Mg and Fe, are octahedrally coordinated. When I talk about the coordination, so you must be aware of the definition of coordination number here. The coordination number is a number which an atom is attached with how many numbers or how many atoms at the certain vicinity. If your X atom is surrounding and coordinating with the 4 Y atoms here, let me draw it with a different color. So if your X atom is coordinating or is constituting or making a molecule by joining the 4 Ys, then you will be saying that yes, this X atom has the 4 coordination number. If it would have been associated with the 6 Ys, then you will call it a octahedral coordination. So same goes with your silicon. At upper mantle conditions, that the silicon coordination number is usually 4, and your cations, for example Mg and Fe, possess the octahedral or 6 coordination numbers. We'll be looking at it in details in next few slides. So as your pressure will increase going down in the mantle, your atoms have to be packed even at higher density or densely packed in order to sustain those high pressure, and to in this process of sustaining at those high pressures, there are structural transformations which take place. Structural transformation in terms of the crystal structures. The crystal structures are transformed in such a way that your silicon or MgFe cations will be adjusting their coordination numbers, or will be adding the, something in their coordination, or some other elements or atoms, in order to be sustained at that high pressure temperature conditions. So as you will go deeper and deeper at high pressures in the mantle, the crystals of the minerals have to be packed even more densely, and in order to make those rearrangements, the silicon and your MgFe cations and all the atoms available, they also change their coordination number, or they add atoms in their coordination number, which will be dealing in details in next few slides. So one of the rearrangement of those, what I am talking about, so one of the rearrangements I am talking about is that the silicon atom usually associates with the other elements, or we can say that the silicon atom adds few more atoms in such a way that its coordination number becomes tetrahedral to octahedral also, which makes them be stable, which gives them the higher density and the densely packed structure, so that they can be stable at higher pressure temperature conditions. So we'll be dealing with this in detail in this slide. So what we are showing here is a typical crystal structure of Mg2SiO4, which is olivine. The Mg version, the forsterite. So this is the usual crystal structure of forsterite or Mg2SiO4 olivine. And as I discussed in the previous slides, that the silicon will be there at tetrahedral coordinations, and your MgFe cations will be occupying or will be adjusted to the octahedral coordinations, and when the pressure will be increased and the mineral will suffer high pressure from upper mantle going all the way down to the lower mantle, then these coordinations arrangements will be changed, and we'll be looking onto that also. So in the present condition, we have a crystal structure of olivine, or we can say forsterite. At upper mantle conditions, the pressure is compared to the lower mantle, the pressure is comparatively low. So you will see these yellow atoms are silicon, and this blue one are the oxygens, and the green you will see are the magnesium atoms. So you will see the rearrangement here. For example, let's talk about this yellow. If you must be able to locate it, there is a blue oxygen atom. Oxygen atom. There is a blue oxygen atom, and you will be able to see the yellow silicon atom behind that. So this yellow silicon atom is associated with how many oxygens? Let's see. 1, the blue one oxygen is there. 2, 3, and this center one 4. So you will see that at upper mantle conditions, during the normal conditions, you would say when your olivine is not changing to any crystal structure, it is still crystallizing in the orthorhombic system. So your silicon is associated with 4 oxygen. As we all know that olivine is a Mg2SiO4 structure, your silicon tetrahedra is arranged in such a way that the silicon atom is associated with the 4 oxygen atoms. So let's look up to some magnesium cations here. For example, this one. You must be able to locate this Mg here. So this green Mg is associated with how many oxygens? Let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. So you will say that Mg is showing the 6 coordination numbers and silicon is showing, let me write it here. So you will say that your silicon is showing 4 coordination numbers, or it will be associated with the 4 oxygens, and your Mg will be showing 6 coordination numbers, or it will be associated with the 6 oxygens, and we can term them respectively as the tetrahedron coordination number and the octahedral coordination number. So this is the crystal structure of an olivine crystal at upper mental depths at normal conditions. As this olivine will go at high pressures deep in the mantle, the structural rearrangements will take place and the solid state transformation will convert this olivine structure to some other structures, which will be discussing in next slides. So the usual understanding for mental transition zone is that there are certain transitions of the minerals in this zone, but apart from that, it is much more interesting to explain why your mental transition zone is interesting, why so much mental petrologists are keen to conduct research in this particular portion also, because it is in terms of the rheological properties, it is different from upper and lower mantle. In terms of your viscosity of the rocks, it is different from upper and lower mantle. So it is a subject of interest for the mental petrologists, and what makes it so special or so interesting is that this is your mental transition zone starting at 4, you will from here, let's mark it here. This is the 410 kilometer where your mental transition zone starts, and it goes all the way up to the 660 kilometers that you all know. So beyond this mental transition zone, it is your upper mental, and below this mental transition zone, it is your lower mental. So as you all know that pressure, when we go all the way down in the mental, the pressure will go up or pressure will be increased. So to sustain those normal chemistry of olivine crystals, to sustain those minerals which have the normal olivine chemistry, they need to be go through the certain modification in their crystal structures, so that they could be stable at higher pressures in the mental transition zone or in the lower mental. So as I discussed earlier and in the previous slide, I've shown that the typical crystal structure of olivine at upper mental depth, you notice that silicon was acquiring the 4 coordination number and your Mg was acquiring the octahedron or 6 coordination numbers with oxygen, which is the case of the olivine at upper mental depths. So at around 410 kilometer, your upper mental is at 410 kilometers, the upper mental is there, and you are now entering to the mental transition zone, the boundary between the upper and lower mental. So at high pressures below lower mental depth or going in the mental transition zone, this is the line where your mental transition zone starts. So as the mineral go below the upper mental and enters in the mental transition zone, we notice that the silicons are having the 4 coordination number and the 6 coordination number as well. So what does that mean is that the silicon will be acquiring the tetrahedral coordination as well as the octahedral coordination. That means the silicon will be associated with the 4 as well as the 6 oxygens or some other atoms, while in the upper mental you saw that the silicon was only associated with the 4 coordination number with 4 oxygens, and the octahedral coordination was acquired by the Mg or Fe cations, but in this case, in the mental transition zone, the silicon will be having 4 and 6 both coordination number, or mix up of the minerals will be encountered in the mental transition zone which have 4 and as well as the 6 coordination numbers. But as you cross the mental transition zone and you enter in the lower mental, all of the silicon will be acquiring only the octahedral coordination number, or only the 6 coordination numbers. Of course, if the crystal structure will be changing, there will be the change in the name of the olivine minerals also, or the olivine structures also. So we'll be looking at the high pressure polymorphs of olivine in the next slide. So here we are showing the high pressure polymorphs of olivine. This is the phase diagram where pressure and temperatures are there, and you will notice that this is the pressure at y-axis in GPa, and this is temperature at x-axis in degree Celsius. So your olivine, which is Mg2SiO4, or people also call it the alpha Mg2SiO4. So as the pressure will be crossed above this 13 GPa, exactly it is 13 GPa, and now you can convert the GPa into the depth also. I told you the conversion, you can multiply 13 by with 33 and you will get the almost an idea of what depth we can expect this much of pressure. So as this alpha olivine from upper mental crosses the 13 GPa line and it goes up to the high pressure, this changed to the Wetzelite, which is called also as the beta spinel or beta Mg2SiO4. So your crystal structure Mg2SiO4 is still the same, Mg2SiO4, but the crystal structure or the molecular arrangement is changed. That's why we are calling them the high pressure polymorphs of olivine. If this Wetzelite further moves or further survives or further experiences more high pressure in the mantle and it crosses the 16 GPa, it changes directly to the gamma spinel. That means this changes to the ringwoodite. The chemistry of ringwoodite is still the same. It is gamma Mg2SiO4. So we started with the Mg2SiO4. This was also the Mg2SiO4, and the final one is also Mg2SiO4, but alpha, beta, gamma denoting the high pressure polymorphs named according to the rearrangements in our solid state transformation in the crystal structure. So at normal conditions below 13 GPa, the olivine is olivine, and when it crosses the 13 GPa line or 13 GPa, more than 13 GPa pressure is exerted on olivine, you will notice that the crystal structure will be changed from that crystal structure I shown you for olivine to the spinel structure, which I will be coming in details in next slide. So the crystal structure changes from orthorhombic or crystal system to it crystallizes as the spinel structure. It goes to the beta spinel structure, and further it goes to the gamma spinel or ringwoodite structure. So the structural transformations are some of the ways these minerals acquire to sustain themselves at high pressure conditions deep in the mantle and high pressure temperature conditions, to remain the chemistry same and to make the sustainability of the mineral possible. There is only the way that they change their crystal structures and their modification in the silicon or Mg-Fe cation coordination numbers to make them stable at even the lower mental depths. Let's talk about the spinel structure, which we talked about, that olivine acquires when it changes to Wetzelite at around 13 GPa. So your alpha Mg2SiO4, which is olivine, changed to Wurtzlerite or beta Mg2SiO4 you call it, and that further pressure was increased and your mineral changed to ringwoodite. So the chemistry was always the Mg2SiO4, but we named them differently because they acquired the different crystal structures, and they acquire this crystal structure of spinel. They don't change into the spinel, but they acquired the crystal structure of spinel. For example, any crystal structure out of all the crystal structures usually identified, the cubic crystal structure happens to be one of the very toughest one to accommodate all the stress or high pressure and to be stable at high pressure conditions in the mantle. So that's why the spinel structure is acquired by your olivine. So this is the spinel structure normally. So when I say spinel structure, I don't mean that your olivine is changing to spinel, because your spinel is magnesium aluminium oxide. Your crystal is still magnesium silicate. It is not changing to the magnesium aluminium oxide, which is a spinel chemistry, but it changes to the structure of spinel, or the spinel structure is denoted or is shown by the cubic packing of the atomic arrangement, or we can say that oxygen are there and your aluminium is acquiring the octahedral coordination. That means it is having the coordination 6, and your Mg is tetrahedrally coordinated. That means it constitutes in this vicinity the 4 oxygens. So cubic packing in the spinel is one of the very suitable structure to be obtained, because it gives them the opportunity to be accommodated at high pressure conditions, and we made it clear that the crystal chemistry is still same. It is not changing to spinel, but the structure is changing to spinel. That's why we call it the spinel structure. So there are around more than 50 different minerals species which are known to adopt the spinel structure as we go down in the mantle. More than 50 of your minerals acquire this spinel structure because it is very stable at high pressures, and the cubic packing is believed to be very competitive to sustain a mineral at high pressure. So more than 50 minerals are known which adopt the spinel structure while we go down in the mantle at high pressure. And this change in the crystal structure is a result of the molecular rearrangement of the atoms. As we noticed that silicon can change from 4 to 6 or 4 and 6 in the mantle transition zone, and at the lower mantle the silicon will be acquiring as the 6 coordination number. So this whole structural changes is attributed to shifting or shuffling the coordinations in such a way that the crystal can be stable at high pressure and temperature depth, or high depth or deeper depths in the mantle. So let's talk about the high pressure polymorphs of pyroxene now, which is the majorite. Now majorite, when we talk about the majorite, the question in your mind comes that, oh, it's a garnet, and does your pyroxene change to garnet? It acquires the structure of majorite. It goes to that high pressure polymorph due to the high pressure exerted by the mantle. For example, let's talk about the normal garnet formula, which is Mg3Al2SiO4 all thrice. So this is the normal chemical formula of the normal garnets. For example, the pyrope garnet or any end member or magnesium aluminium. Let's assume the normal garnet or any magnesium aluminium garnet. It has the chemistry like that, and you will notice that your majorite, let me write it here only, Mg3 Mg Si and SiO4 the whole thrice. So this is your majorite and this is your normal garnet. So what is the difference that you are observing here? you will see that in the normal garnets, the silicon is only associated with the 4 oxygens. That means it is acquiring only the 4 coordination or tetrahedron coordination number. But in the case of your majorite, you will notice an extra silicon atom here. So what that silicon is doing, it has acquired, along with the tetrahedron coordination number, it is also existing at octahedral coordination number. So you will notice that the silicon is present with the 4 and 6 coordination number. So it gives us the clue that this can be a mineral which can be found in the metal transition zone, where your the minerals experience the 4 and 6 coordination number, the mixture of that. So that is the further topic to be discussed. So we can see that why we are differentiating, why our majorite garnet is different from other garnets, the normal garnets. Pyroxene, we are talking about all the minerals which are the Mg variety or the Mg version, Mg end members of all these olivine, pyroxene minerals. So when we talk about the pyroxene, we are talking about the enstatite here. So Mg variety of pyroxene, enstatite, when it is subjected to 22 GPa deep in the mantle, you can again convert it in the depths with multiplying it 33, which will be like 726 kilometers. So at around 726 kilometers in the mantle at 22 GPa and 1550 temperature also, your enstatite or your pyroxene changes to the achemotite. This is the variety of the high pressure polymorph of the pyroxene. And if further your enstatite is subjected to the higher pressure, it melts and subsequently gives rise to the majorite pyrope garnet, which is again the high pressure polymorph of this pyroxene. So your pyroxene transformation goes like pyroxene, then achemotite, pyroxene, then achemotite, and then to the majorite. So this is the transformation. So the chemistry will be remaining the same, but the crystal structure will be changing. Now moving on to the further high pressure survivors of pyroxene chemistry, or the further high pressure polymorphs of pyroxene. Pyroxene changes to perovskite when it crosses even the 22 GPa, 24 GPa, it goes to the lower mantle. So at around 27 GPa, 27 to 32, when the pressure is exerted so much, again you convert your 27 with the 33 kilometer depth. So when your pyroxene is subjected to even high pressures, that is goes up to the lower mantle, it changes to a structure which is called the perovskite structure. Again, it is a significant and representative kind of mineral in the lower mantle, because it possesses a crystal structure which is very competitive when it comes to sustaining the pressure and temperature. Usually your perovskite is rare in your natural assemblages. So for example, we are talking about the high pressure polymorphs of olivine or pyroxene, and we are talking about such and such depths, for example 720 kilometers, 22 GPa and all that. So how do we study these minerals? Do we get the first hand access onto these minerals? Do we get them physically and then analyze them, or they are very rare in the natural examples? So answer is that they are very rare in natural examples, because to get a rock sample from 660 or 720 or 800 kilometers in the mantle is quite impossible. We do get samples from that depth in terms of your the mantle peridotites at the ophiolitic sequences through the orogenic events can come all the way up to the surface, and you can have all those rock samples which have survived the pressure at that depth. Or you can have those samples in the form of mantle xenoliths. When your plume travels from the mantle, it acquires some of the xenoliths from the surrounding rocks at deeper levels. They can take them all the way up as the xenoliths also. So, but when it comes to the natural assemblages, it is very rare that we encounter such and such high pressure polymorphs. The perovskite, which is MgFeSiO3, it possesses a very simple crystal structure. It is an identical or an representative mineral of shock metamorphosed meteorites. So when your meteorites shook terrain, or they show an impact on a rock body, the pressure goes at around 27 to 32 GPa. You will start to notice that there are veins developed due to the high pressure, and these veins are of perovskite. So that's how you get the perovskites in natural assemblages, whether in the form of the shock metamorphosed meteorites or the mental xenoliths, or at the orogenic events shown by the peridotites of ophiolitic sequences. Now, if pressure is further exerted on a higher scale, the perovskite goes to change even at higher pressures, which is a structure called the post-perovskite structure, the PPV structure. It is considered one of the most stable crystal structures of any minerals in the mantle. So if the pressure is raised so much, the perovskite can also change to the post-perovskite at even in the lowermost few 100 kilometers of Earth's mantle. So the perovskite changes to post-perovskite at around the lowermost part of your lower mantle. For example, the below 2500 kilometers depth, you can convert back it to the pressures. As I said, that it can be expected to occur in the lower mantle depth. And if we talk about the transition or depth of transformation of perovskite to post-perovskite, as I said, that this is to be encountered in the lowermost part of the lower mantle, which is very close to the D double dash layer. So you can say that it is a representative minerals which comes from so much depth where your D double dash layer is found, and this all process influences the convective melting, because there is a thermal contrast at that particular place, and which in turn is responsible for the plate tectonics which we observe and study on the surface. So you saw how these pyroxene high pressure polymorphs change their crystal structures, going from upper mantle to the lower mantle and the lowermost part of the lower mantles and up to the D double dash layer, and that is all for the olivine and pyroxene high pressure polymorphs. Let's move to the plagioclase high pressure polymorphs. So we all know, and it is very well postulated, that plagioclase is such a mineral that it only is found at Earth's crustal levels, but it can also be occurred in the mantle conditions, but with different crystal structures, and that name is also given differently. So it is not exactly the plagioclase which occurs at the mantle depths, but the mineral name is hollandite. So your plagioclase changes to hollandite at around 12 GPa and 900 degrees Celsius at the mantle transition zone. So your plagioclase will be changed to hollandite at around 12 GPa, which is like 396 kilometers, or you can say that after entering the mantle transition zone, your plagioclase will be converted to the hollandite. The chemistry will always remain the same, NaAlSi3O8, but the crystal structure will be different. The crystal structure will be modified or transformed in order to get the stability which is needed to sustain at that high pressure temperature conditions. Now, this hollandite can also be formed, experimentally during the experimental petrology. So let me introduce a bit of the experimental petrology also. In experimental petrology, what we do is that we take the synthetic rocks or minerals and we make them react as reactants given the pressure adjusted as per the conditions we want to study in the mantle. For example, if we want to see that the product A and B, after reacting, how they will behave at around 20 GPa, so we fix 20 GPa or we react them at 20 GPa at surface in our experimental petrology lab, and we then analyze that what are the phases which are formed, which could be expected at 20 GPa naturally in the mantle. So this hollandite can also be formed at around 21 to 24 GPa experimentally with reacting the jadeite and plus stishovite. So jadeite and stishovite can react to form the hollandite at around 21 to 24 GPa, in your experimental petrology lab. So if the pressure is further raised above the 24 GPa, your hollandite transforms to the calcium ferrite structure, which is CaFeO2 whole twice, the most stable structure considered in terms of the calcium and ferric oxide structures. Calcium ferrite is a very high pressure structure which is obtained by this hollandite, even at higher pressures around 24 GPa. So as I explained earlier also, all these minerals were initially explained using all the experimental simulation methods in the experimental petrology, using the synthetic materials and to react them at certain conditions we want to study in the mantle. And then we explained, and then we found that such and such mineral can react and they can give rise to the such and such minerals, and that's what can be expected naturally also in the mantle at high pressure temperature conditions. So all these high pressure minerals are a subject of the experimental petrology. As I said, it's very rare to sample these high pressure polymorphs. So most of these phenomena, or most of these structure transformations were initially explained through the experimental simulations at higher PT conditions. The instrument which is used for these experiments is the diamond anvil cell. So this is an arrangement, high pressure device which is used in the experimental petrology to study the behavior and structural transformation or any other properties of high pressure minerals. So we generate those conditions at our laboratory, and we then, without going down in the mantle, without having the first hand access of the samples, we can tell that at such and such PT conditions such and such minerals can be expected. So let's move to the fluids and volatiles in the mantle. So when it comes to the fluids or volatiles in the mantle, the usual understanding of the students is that we are talking about the fluid inclusions only. We are talking about the fluid inclusions, but it has much more to explain when it comes to the fluids in the mantle or volatiles in the mantle. So mantle fluids or volatiles are the important carrier of the elements between the mantle, crust, and finally to the atmosphere. As your magma travels, for example, in the case of the mantle plume, as your hot rocks upwell through the mantle, the volatiles and fluids are there in the magma, whether in the dissolved form with the silicate magma or as the separate volatiles. So they are the very essential carriers of the chemicals from mantle to the atmosphere through the crust. As I said, they can be dissolved or trapped as fluid inclusion in the minerals, or they can be separately available in the silicate magma. These volatiles and fluids influence the stability of the mantle phases also, as you saw in the slide where we show that how does the mantle peridotite melt during the subduction settings. So where that H2O, being a volatile, influenced the stability of the metal peridotite, and it made them melt even at lesser temperature, so solidus temperature. So that's how they influence the stability of many metal phases. Next is they also control the rheology. So the rheology is the deformation and plastic flow of rocks. How does the rock in the mantle flow, or how does it deform? So the way it is deformed, it is also up to a certain level is controlled by your fluids. They control the melting of peridotites, as we saw in the subduction related settings. So if we talk about the constituents of volatiles in the mantle, you know, what elements are there which constitute these volatiles, because we when we talk about the volatiles, okay, we are convinced that they have much more to tell, you know, rather than the fluid inclusions, they are also dissolved in the silicate magma. But what are the elements really contributing to the constitution of these volatiles? So the elements are mostly carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, sulfur, and your halogens. Almost all of your volatiles, whether in mantle or crust, will always be constituting, you know, combining these elements only, whether it will be CO2, CNO, carbon monoxide, C plus O, H2O, H2S, SO2, all of or for example HCl, all your volatiles in the mantle, or we can say generalized in the crust and mantle, or they are only constituted through the way only selected 4 to 5 elements. And your volatiles can be in fluid phase, as I said, they can be dissolved in the silicate melts, or they can be as the carbonate rich liquids. For example, in the cases of carbonatite, you will see that it is an igneous rock composed entirely of the carbonate magma. So in that case also, during the synthesis of carbonates, CO2, NMGO, CaO and CO2. So CO2 plays a different role, and I would say an important role in terms of the crystallization of the carbonatic magma also. So now moving on to the speciation of the phases in the mantle. What is speciation? The speciation is the evolution of these phases, you know, as they travel from a place A to B. For example, if we are talking about, so if we talk about the speciation, the speciation is the evolution of different phases of different elements as they travel from up to down, or downwards to upwards. So the speciation can be defined, it is the evolution of the phases as they go from upward to downward, or downward to upward in the Earth's subsurface. So for example, you will notice, or it is very common phenomena, that when we go down from your surface, for example, this is your surface, this is crust, this is mantle, and this is your outer core, inner core. So as you will go down, generally you will experience the deficiency of oxygen. That means your oxygen fugacity will be low if you go down in the mantle. Or further, what is oxygen fugacity? It is the availability of oxygen, or we can say the partial pressure of oxygen which is available to react with certain phases. So it basically is the, in a general way we can say that it is the availability of oxygen which is there, and in the conditions of high oxygen fugacity, there is enough oxygen that it can react with the phases and make oxidized phases in the result. So if we talk about the speciation, as your oxygen fugacity will be decreasing, what does that mean is that the conditions will be changing from, as your oxygen fugacity will decrease, the conditions will be changing from oxidation to reduction. So that means you will experience the reducing conditions as the minerals will go from upward to downward in the mantle or further down. And due to these reducing conditions, the phases will change their compositions also, and that's why we call it the speciation. For example, the oxidized phases, for example CO2, if it is subducted to or if it is subjected to the reducing conditions, it can change to hydrocarbon or carbon monoxide. So it is still the phase of carbon, but they are having the different oxidation states with the surrounding. They are having the different oxidation conditions, because there you can see there is enough oxygen that it can constitute to form the carbon monoxide, but in the case of hydrocarbon, there is not enough oxygen so that it could go, this carbon could go into the state where the enough oxygen was there, and it can form the oxidized phase of carbon. So that's how this carbon phase will speciate through as per the conditions oxidation or reduction. So these are the various reactions which take place, and you call them the redox reactions, which you must have studied during your school. The redox reactions are the medium to speciate these phases, whether of carbon or sulfur or hydrogen and so on. So all of these elements which constitute the volatiles, the basic funda that different volatiles behave differently in terms of the chemical composition is only a matter of the speciation, because the speciation or the evolution of the certain phases of different elements, for example carbon and sulfur and hydrogen, that speciation is controlled by the oxygen fugacity, which gets lowered while we go down in the mantle, and it is increased from going downwards to the upwards. So the shallow mantle will be, of course, characterized with the oxidized phases like CO2, because the oxygen fugacity is high there, and the reducing conditions will be encountered while we go down in the lower mantle. So it is like the oxidation to reduction generally. If you will go in details, that's a separate part. That's not of your related to your competitive exams, the specifications of all these mechanisms. We just have to be aware of the fact that generally it can be expected that the oxygen fugacity will decrease from going crust to the mantle and downwards, and in other ways you can say that your reducing conditions will be increasing while we go down in the mantle, which in turn will control the speciation of different volatiles, whether they will be the oxidized phases or will be the reduced phases down in the mantle. So now moving on to one of the reduced phase of carbon, that is the hydrocarbon. Recently you must have noticed, and there are lectures also going on the petroleum geology here. So all of you are very aware that the petroleum or hydrocarbon which is found at the subsurface in the crustal levels is of biogenic origin, but there are the hydrocarbons which are of abiotic origin. That means they don't have anything to do with the biotic, the catagenesis, metagenesis processes. They are not formed that way. They are completely originated at the abiogenic conditions in the mantle, and they are hence they are called as the abiotic origin. So these are the evidences which we get from the fluid inclusion. These are some photographs of fluid inclusions studies done on the mantle minerals. So for example, this is the olivine, and you will see there are the different fluid inclusions of hydrocarbon, and this olivine is derived from mantle transition zone. That means we are talking about at around 410 to 660 kilometers. So there is no question that you can form the hydrocarbon there with the biogenic origin. So they are completely of the abiotic origin, And the second picture, I don't know if it is available, these are the fluid inclusions of hydrocarbon again. This is from the diopside, which is a plume derived diopside from a pyroxenite, again an ultramafic rocks. So there are evidences that your hydrocarbon can also be formed through the abiotic processes deep in the mantle, and it can be said that the mantle can host a vast reservoir of hydrocarbon. I'm not talking about the exploitation, that we can exploit it or not, that is the matter of exploring the E&P companies, but I am just trying to put a point here that there would be a vast reservoir of hydrocarbon in the mantle. If it would have been possible to exploit it, it could solve all the energy crises of the world. And this is evident, or this is the proof of those hydrocarbon forming abiogenically in the mantle are these photographs, and there are various studies which show that the hydrocarbon can form abiogenically in the mantle. So how does it form? There is a question that where does that hydrocarbon in the mantle come from? If it is not from your the regular, if it is not a process, or if it is not a result of regular process of catagenesis and metagenesis, and or the kerosene is involved, so how does that hydrocarbon form? Where does it come from? So the hydrocarbon can be of primitive mantle origin. That means it can be present from the time the earth was formed. For example, it can be present as a primordial gas which was delivered by the meteorites during the accretion of the earth. That means when the earth's accretion was taking place, so there are chances that it was delivered from the external bodies and it has been preserved in the mantle. From the time of accretion of the mantle also, it can, that means it can be of primordial origin of the mantle also. Second thing, it can form through the reduction of carbonates also. Your calcite, magnesite, siderite, your CaCO3, MgCO3 and FeCO3 respectively, your carbonates, when they are subjected to the reducing conditions, again when I talk about the reducing conditions, I am talking about going down in the mantle where the oxygen fugacity will decrease. So we are talking about the high pressure conditions in the mantle where the oxygen fugacity is quite low, and there are the reducing conditions where your carbonates can be reduced to form the hydrocarbon. There is no kerosene involved, no biogenic process is done, but your hydrocarbon is formed totally inorganic processes through the inorganic processes. So let's look at this reaction. Generally the calcium carbonates are subjected to the reduction where the hydrogen is involved, and you will having the hydrocarbon or methane as a result with CO and H2 as the byproduct. So one of the reason of origination of hydrocarbon in the mantle can be of the primordial origin at the time of accretion of the earth. Second reason can be that they can form through the reduction of carbonates also at reducing conditions. They can directly be reduced, your CO2 can directly be reduced to hydrocarbon also. Your oxidized phase of carbon, while going down in the mantle at the reducing conditions, your CO2 can change to hydrocarbon. That's what the speciation of carbon is. That means the phase is evolving through the reducing and oxidation conditions. Now again, you can say that the hydrocarbon can be formed through the hydrogenation of graphite, that is the carbon, or the metal carbide Fe3C. So there are so many processes which are, which can be responsible for the process or the formation of hydrocarbon of abiotic origin. For example, the first one was that it can be of primordial origin, formed during the accretion of earth and preserved, and the second one was the reduction of carbonates at reducing conditions, subjecting deep down in the mantle. The third reason is the reduction of carbon dioxide directly at the reducing conditions again, and the other reason can be the hydrogenation of graphite or the iron carbides, that is the reducing phases which are encountered deep in the mantle in reducing conditions. So there are various mechanism involved which tell us about that the abiotic origin of hydrocarbon can be formed in the mantle, or it can be available at the time from the time the earth was created. The next interesting fact, and it can be asked in your exams also, let's talk about the H2O in the mantle. It is a basic property of mantle transition rocks, a mantle transition zone, that the rocks in the MTZ have the higher viscosity compared to the upper mantle and the lower mantle, because there is the water available in the mantle transition zone. And by saying that, we can say there are studies that there can be as much as water in the earth's mantle that it can fill all your oceans. That means all of the oceans available on the earth today, that much amount of water can be present in the mantle also. But hold for a second, it has been proved experimentally. Second thing, it is locked up as the crystal within the crystal structure of the mineral. It is not available as liquid water. It is available in the crystal structure of minerals as ions rather than the liquid water. But there is enough amount of hydrocarbon and water in the mantle. And if we specifically talk about the water, it is that much in amount that it can be equal to all the water available in your oceans. So again, all of these reactions were performed through the experimental simulations on synthetic rocks, and which are the typical PT conditions on the typical PT conditions of the mantle transition zone, and we obtained that kind of reactions, and it was also proved that there is the lower viscosity of mantle transition zone rocks because there is the water present in the structures of the crystals. That can be the reason that why your MTZ, mantle transition zone, have lower viscosity compared to the upper mantle and lower mantle. So there are further questions which are related to the further research. You don't have to be dealing all those in your curriculum. You just have to be aware. There are recently asked questions related to the recently developed concepts and all that. So you just have to be aware of all those processes, which will be covering in the following lectures here also. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and let's meet in the next one.